afternoon, everybody, on this side of the Atlantic. Good morning to those on the other side of the Atlantic. I will give you very brief information on how you can ask questions on this webinar of the OECD, and give the floor to Natalie Clicquot to start the webinar. So, first of all, just a slide in case somebody cannot hear the sound, which should now be transmitted to everybody. They should check this screen and to click on Communicate and Audio Broadcast in order to get the sound. So, at the right of your screen, you should be able to see a Q&A box, question and answer. You type your question and send it to all panelists. So select all panelists, type the question, send it. Please not use the chat box because it gets confusing and we might not see your question. Gather all the questions from the question and answer box and display them to reply to them after the presentations. So the floor now to Natalie.
Sander, good afternoon or good morning or good evening from wherever you are joining us. We are very happy to have you on board for this second webinar on local economic resilience. And for those of you who have not yet have not been there yesterday, I will just give a quick introduction before we give the floor to our panelists today. And we're very happy to welcome you. We have participants from around 23 countries, so we're very pleased that you are able to join us. I will presentation, a quick introduction, just to quickly give a little bit more, and this is for people who were not there yesterday, just to describe a little bit the objectives of this project is to explore the link between local resilience and the capacity to adapt to long-term changes, mainly at the local level. And what we want to do is really to look at the concept, but also practical dimensions of this notion of local economic resilience, and hopefully to be able to build a tool for practitioners to develop something more practical and concrete for local actors. And in terms of our deliverables, we will do this webinar series in December. There would be two, the one from yesterday and today, and then in January 2 other webinars, and February a last one. We will use all the outcomes from this discussion in a chapter of our lead publication on job creation and local economic development due in 2016, and we also hope to launch a call for case studies because we want to work on local case studies. I will tell you more about that at the end of this webinar, and we'll have a policy paper capturing all results at the end of 2016 also. So just to let you know, yesterday we had this first webinar and we tried to focus on defining the notion of local economic resilience or local resilience, and we started discussing how fuzzy the concept was, and we needed to be careful about conceptual stretch across disciplines, but we also said that this is a concept that is very useful and resonates strongly with local policymakers and practitioners. We tried to explore some of the factors of resilience, and we'll do a little bit more today. And we started to discuss the relationship between resilience and economic diversity, and then diversity versus specialization. We also addressed at the end a question on resilience and whether it was actually culturally oriented or defined, and this was interesting. We looked at resilience at the capacity to adapt, so a kind of a property of a place, but we also looked at resilience as a process. We mentioned the importance of time. We looked at what it meant for shock versus slow burn situations, and then we asked, resilience for whom? Is it for individuals, companies, local areas, and and we also talked about the distributional issues around this concept. At the end, the group mentioned that local case study approach was interesting. Also, local scenarios elaboration could be good to help local practitioners on this resilience concept. But yesterday we also had the opportunity to to discuss some of the measurement issues, and just to give you a brief summary of what was brought yesterday. Like, are we trying to measure outcomes, or are we to try to measure this capacity? What does it mean, regional economic performance? These are big questions. What are our favorite indicators? Also, how difficult it is to measure networks, institutions, or culture. How do you measure that? Also, are we talking about measuring relative or absolute growth or change? And again, this question of the time frame. What is the time reference for this analysis? And I think I'll let you there, because we have a very good panelists today. We are welcoming Professor Menno Fenger from the University of Erasmus in Rotterdam, in the Netherlands. He will actually introduce us to his project. I think it was a project funded by the EU on innovative social policies for inclusive and resilient labor markets in Europe. So I think this project is interesting because you explored the structural reasons for some of the differences observed on labor markets. So this is the link with labor market. Although it's at national level, I guess you will have to tell us a few things. Why could this be relevant for local areas? And then we will welcome Dr. Adrian Healy, who is a research associate at the University of Cardiff in Wales in the UK. And you've also been involved in an EU project called EPSON, and where you looked at resilience of regions in this economic crisis. So this would be interesting. You've also been involved in using territorial evidence to develop public policy frameworks on building resilient regions. So you've been working with this notion of resilience for a while. So without further ado, I think, just to explain, I will give the floor now to Menno and to Adrian. Please, I will remind everybody of the 10 minutes. So don't be surprised if I jump in to say 10 minutes are over. And then what we will do is we will have a Q&A session. And while you will be typing your question, we will have a discussion with panelists. We are very happy to have also on board Neil McInroy from the Center for Local Economic Strategies based in Manchester. He was a panelist yesterday, but is also joining us today. So we'll have a wrap-up of, hopefully, of this session and yesterday's session. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Menno.
To share my screen with you. Thank you very much for the invitation, and a warm welcome to all of you from Rotterdam, Netherlands. What I would like to do with you is to explain a little bit how we have used the concept of resilience and explored the possibilities of the concept of resilience in the EP7 funded project that Natalie referred to. Indeed, I will reflect on the possibilities for using a similar approach in exploring resilience in at the local and regional level. What started with when starting this project is observations that labor markets seem to have different absorption capacities. We know during the economic crisis, Germany has been seen as the example of a country that has gone through the economic crisis without much of unemployment consequences. It actually has performed quite well in terms of employment. But if we look at GDP development, then it's no surprise that Germany has not has experienced so much difficulties in terms of unemployment because GDP growth was quite steady in the period as well. So does this make Germany a resilient country? And our answer in the product is no, because GDP development and employment figures have grown steadily. Another totally different example is Bulgaria, which has had a lot of problems during the economic crisis, but our measurements, and I will explain how we get there, it has been quite resilient because if the labor market had not functions the way it functioned, unemployment would be much higher. So this is basically the line of argumentation that I would like to share with you. In concepts, labor market resilience is the capacity of a labor market to resist with or recover from external challenges in order to maintain or improve its pre-shock state. And we see that the concept is gaining popularity both at the OECD level and the European Community level. And what we are explaining in Inspires, the project we're running, is basically not only how do countries come through economic shocks, but more specifically, how are specific vulnerable groups within countries affected by economic shocks. So what we try to do is to have a double comparative approach, both between countries for all of the vulnerable groups that we have defined, namely youth, migrants, older workers, and disabled workers. But we're also interested in the within countries. So how do each of these groups relate to each other in terms of employment and employability? And finally, we would like to share some insights and explore a bit more in detail the relation between resilience and economic growth. Don't get there from this quite full screen, but what I want to share with you is, for instance, the remarkable differences between groups that have. The line in all of the countries is the GDP line, and as you can see, for instance, in the Netherlands, we have had quite a sharp drop in GDP between 2008 and 2010, which is not reflected in the employment figures, none of the groups that we have defined. But if you take, for instance, the case of Estonia, then we see a quite increase in unemployment levels, all of the groups. This is reflected by the GDP drop, which reflects the GDP drop that Estonia has experienced during the crisis. And in other countries, we see that some groups are affected much harder, much more intense than some of the others. So migrants, for instance, in Sweden, are much worse than some of the other vulnerable groups that we have seen. That's not the answer, but this is where our puzzle starts. How possible that groups are affected in such different ways between countries? And I'll share with you in the remaining 5 minutes the answer to that question. Well, we start from an institutional framework, but between there, we should refer to the so-called Okun's law, which has been made famous by Mr. Okun, which is not basically a law, but a rule of thumb. Mr. Okun says that for each 2% in GDP drop or increase, 1% unemployment increase or drop is similar. So a 2% increase in GDP will lead to a 1% decrease in unemployment and the other way around, which more or less a rule of thumb that has been not proven but tends to come up quite intensely when we do correlation studies between economic growth and unemployment. That's our starting point, but as you have seen in the previous slide, this is not a law because we can see clear differences. Where do these differences come from? First of all, of course, demographic conditions. So migration, the number of people leaving the country might affect the unemployment levels that we have seen. So the economic condition, the structure, is it a service economy as opposed to a production economy, is an open or a closed country, and so on and so forth. And third, we have identified a set of institutional characteristics, so the extensiveness of the welfare state, what benefit arrangements are there for people to fall back on in terms of in times of unemployment, to what extent are social partners involved in the design of labor market relations, so the extensiveness of social dialogue, and so on and so forth. And what I try to do is to put all this in an economic model which enables us to show differences between different groups within countries and show differences between similar groups in different countries. And due to the economic method that we have used, we could try to make differences much more comparable and explain these. The idea is quite simple, but to end, it seems to work. There's a lot to wish for, and how the OECD project will help in further defining this, but it starts quite hopeful. So what we did is we tried to model the unemployment rates for the population and each of the vulnerable groups, and one of the independent variables is the GDP, and some of the other independent variables I've shown you just. And if this model fits to some extent, but not fully, we could say that the level we cannot explain, that is the resilience of a country. That is the level to the country has managed to come up with new policies, with new ideas, with new incentives to combat the consequences of the crisis. And this is not only our theoretical idea, but actually, and is what makes it, I think, useful for the OECD LEAD project as well, this is a model that has been used by giving the budget for social assistance to municipalities in the Netherlands. So the Dutch government has an extensive econometric model in which all kinds of independent variables are used to predict the number of people requiring or claiming social assistance in a municipality. If the number of people within that municipality is higher, if the number of people claiming social assistance is higher, then obviously the municipality has not done enough to combat social assistance, so it has not done in terms of prevention, in terms of training, in terms of economic development, and so on. They need to surplus the minus that they have on this budget from other sources, and the other way around. If a municipality is performing better than expected on the basis of the model, then it is allowed to keep the money that it has been awarded in first instance. So let me get to the results, but firstly to some characteristics. I think the first step is that the regression analysis is doing significantly, but is not explaining enough. But about 30% is explaining the models that we have, but we could do better. And I think in next stages we'll be able, or other partners will be able to improve the model. Now, what we did is predict on the basis of our model, and what we have used in terms of defining resilience is the sum of the actual developments and the predicted developments as an indicator. And what we see is very strong differences between countries and between groups. In the next slide, I will show you some in detail. But if Belgium 2010 total unemployment minus 3.4, this means that on the basis of the changes in GDP 2009, we would have expected the unemployment levels in Belgium to be 24% higher than they actually are. Let me repeat this. So this figure is the deviation of the predicted and the actual value. Shown you, and this is my 10th warning. I have shown you that how it looks like. And see for Belgium that total unemployment is minus 3.20%. We would have expected on the base of the economic development in Belgium. And the pain has been distributed quite equally among the groups. Youth is doing even a bit better than expected, but older works not as good, but not dramatically, and migrants are on the prediction spot on. In Italy, it's the other way around. It has not performed as well for the total unemployment level as we would have expected, but youth here is obviously the loser of the economic crisis. Youth unemployment has risen more than all of the other groups, and then we would have expected on the basis of the model. And here Germany as such is not as bad as expected. But the other groups, and then we would have expected on the basis of the model. And here Germany as such is not as bad as expected. But Germany as such is not as bad as expected. And here Germany as such is not as bad as expected. But the other groups, and then we would have expected on the basis of the model. And here Germany as such is not as bad as expected. But Germany as such is not as bad as expected. But Germany as such is not as bad as expected. But Germany as such is not as bad as expected. But Germany as such is not as bad as expected. But Germany as such is not as bad as expected. But Germany as such is not as bad as expected. But Germany as such is not as bad as expected. But Germany as such is not as bad as expected. But Germany as such is not as bad as expected. But Germany as such is not as bad as expected. But Germany as such is not as bad as expected. But Germany as such is not as bad as expected. But Ger resilient country because GDP developments have not been as intense as in some other countries, but it has managed to decrease youth unemployment magnificently, obviously also as a consequence of the harsh reforms. And as you can see, the other groups are doing as we would have predicted. Lessons to be learned from this first steps towards modeling labor market resilience. What we see is that the relation between unemployment and GDP is not significant, but as expected. It is not Oken's law, but the deviations in Oken's law can be used to get a grip on what makes a country, but also region or municipality, resilient. This regression analysis, the nice thing about regression analysis is that it's more or less proven technology. As I said, we use it to distribute budget among municipalities in the Netherlands. And the final bullet here is that resilience, in our point of view, is not similar to employment performance. So if we make rankings in Europe of which countries have done best during the crisis, then we might try to ban Germany from the first place because it has done remarkably well in terms of unemployment, but it has not suffered an intense crisis as some other countries. And there might be other countries that have been much more resilient during the crisis than Germany, if we look at the way we did. And I'm first to admit that these models need refining, but thank you for the opportunity to share with you the basic ideas, and I hope I've shown you that this regression-based modeling of labor market resilience might be a first step to get grip on the complex issue of local and regional economic resilience. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Menno. This was really interesting. Also to see that these measurements or these tools can also be used in a practical way for policymakers. But let me turn to Adrian. Perhaps you want also to share with us your ideas about local economic resilience and what you did in your projects on trying to measure it.
Thank you, Natalie, and it's a pleasure to be taking part in this webinar at the moment, which is all about building resilience in local labour markets, as well as looking about the capacity to adapt to long-term changes as well. Now, I think I've been set quite a strong task in 10 minutes. Been asked to address 3 key questions for the webinar. Questions about what factors affect economic resilience, how we might measure this, and also how do we apply resilience to regional labour markets themselves. What I want to do is try to address these through drawing on some of the work that we did, as I mentioned, through the SBON project, which was the economic crisis and the resilience of regions. This actually asks 2 questions. Why are some regions are affected by economic shocks more than others? What are faster than others when they are affected? And so what can policymakers do about that? In 10 minutes I just want to introduce a few key points and then a few key considerations. So forgive me if I skip over a number of things quite quickly. Some starting point, though, is the question about, well, how did Europe fare itself? And what we did was we sought to look at the turning points, the points at which each region, and which we took at a NUTS 2 level in Europe, but NUTS 3, NUTS 1, and NUTS 0, so we did local through to national. The question was, if each region, in terms of the turning point, the point that they entered into the downturn themselves, not just taking 2008 as a common starting point, but addressing when each region went economic downturn, which had recovered within a period of approximately 3 years. And we took this on the basis of recovery rates that were identified from the previous European downturn in the 1990s. What we found was that around 15% of regions were not affected by the crisis at all. These are the ones that are in blue in the map that you can see at the moment. They managed to resist or withstand the economic crisis. They hadn't gone to downturn at all. I see regions in Poland and in Germany in that way, also in Switzerland and again in other parts of Northwest Europe. Around a quarter of regions had managed to recover to their pre-crisis peak employment, and we use employment rates as map, although we also did the analysis using GDP. And those recovery ones are in green on the map that you can see on the left. However, around a third region, 33%, that we can see within yellow on the map, had entered the crisis, but after 3 years had not yet recovered to the pre-crisis peak. But they had begun to recover. They were on the upturn. The difficulty was for the other 29%, those that are marked out in red within the map on the left, where there was no upturn at all. They were still in economic decline 3 years after they had entered into the recession themselves. So the key from this, in a sense, is that national levels are quite strong in terms of where resilience can be found, but the resilience is also in some places a more regional and also local phenomena from there. The important reason for looking at this, of course, was try to identify those factors which differentiated between those regions which were resilient, those which stood crisis or recovered, and those which weren't resilient, those which we hadn't seen a recovery to the pre-crisis peak. So looking for, to try to account for this, we divided into 4 key categories: the notion of business, notions of people, place, community, which were kind of brought together by a 5th category, which is around the notion of governance as well. And just briefly into some of the key criteria identified that were having an effect here, we can see that the feature promoted resilience in terms of the business base was having a diverse economic economy, essentially, a regional economy that was very diverse. Diverse in the nature of the sectors that were there, the markets that firms were operating within, but also diverse in terms of the different business models that were adopted from there. I mean, to go to a point that Menno made, other economies were more resilient on the whole than those that were closed. A feature around the business space was that economies that were more innovative, which score higher on innovation indexes, tended to be more resilient over time to the economic crisis as well. The notion of people, there were 2 key findings that stood out. First, that those regions which have got high levels of skills and experience tended to be resilient to the economic crisis and to recover more rapidly. Equally, regions at high levels of market participation also tend to be more resilient. We can see the notion of urban characteristics. Cities were more resilient on the whole than rural areas and more remote areas. Rural cities were actually slightly less resilient on a relative basis to those which are the secondary economic centres. But in all cases, urban characteristics came out very strongly. Yes, the value of community features. And here, at high levels of social capital were positive attributes for those regions that exhibited resilience. And for those communities where levels of poverty were lower, levels of inequality were less marked, also tended to be more resilient over time. And finally, good governance came out very strongly in terms of the ability of places to recover to the economic shock. If we look at the labour market dimension, though, there are no questions that we start to look at here. And I just want to highlight perhaps some challenges and some trade-offs. This slide quite quickly from there. Equally, about labour market policies, approach we take to labour markets, we don't want to protect levels of employment, to minimise levels of unemployment that we see developing within a region. We want to protect levels of wages and disposable incomes. Often we want to protect the number of hours worked. That we often consider policies which are aimed at maintaining employment and wages, maintaining training, policies to try to avoid the deepening of divides between different aspects of the population. What are they, though? Rising unemployment, falling wages, falls of household disposable income, and reduced working hours were often a perhaps legitimate response to economic shock. And that is a feature of a resilient economy in the short term, because actually these are signals which enable people to, and firms in particular, but also government and public sector, to move towards a more transformational dimension, to actually adapt to the new circumstances. This is if we seek to protect employment levels, if we seek to maintain wage levels at the current level, if we can do this over a short period of time, but over the longer term, it may actually hinder our response to the economic crisis. When we think about how aspects work within labour markets, we often have to differentiate between short-term and the long-term. And one of the big questions that came forward was, while unemployment may go up slightly, while wages may be reduced slightly, while hours worked might also be reduced, how do they recover? The action themselves, to a certain extent, is less significant than the recovery rate that we're coming forward. Features that we've talked about here are very structural, the kind of the innate characteristics that we find within a region. And we'd like to highlight from our findings is the importance of some of the softer features that we find in regional economies operate. The importance, as we heard before, of adaptability, the importance of the capacity, the capability, and the willingness to act of public sector administrations, as well as firms as well. And this is the way that public sector operates, public authorities. We see the presence of flexible policy instruments, able to adapt to new circumstances and new contexts. It's hard to produce a totally new policy instrument. It takes time which we often haven't got when we're looking to respond to an economic shock or an economic crisis. And so having existing policies that we can adapt is an important dimension in the policy mix. What about the role of choices and expectations? People act differently. Their choices on the basis of their expectations of the future. This is influence their capacity, the capability and willingness to act. In a small box on the right, those choices, those expectations are often shaped by the actions of others and the context in which you're operating. A firm will copy neighbours. A neighbour will copy their neighbour. Key parts of this is we have to think about regional economies as self-organising systems. There isn't a dependency relationship which is going on there. And in that respect, we have to be thinking about how informed and how aware our population is, but also our firms, our public authorities, in that we shape expectations, as well as availability of alternative paths, the notion of diversity coming through, which relates to the ability to learn at that point as well. What I want to stress in the last couple of minutes that I have here is the sense of recognising that all places are different. Solutions have to be place-based, as well as being horizontal across member states or regions. Equally, the choices that we have now are often constrained by what we did in the past, and the choices that we make now, we think, will influence how we're able to respond and react to changes in the future. We also highlight the importance of bearing a risk, that it's up to each individual labour market or each individual region to try and guarantee their own future, but actually we have to have a shared guarantor within this, where we're able to socialise the risk that comes forward. In terms of final reflections, there is word of warning and significance of context. While there are lots of correlations between factors that influence resilience, on various analysis, when we're looking at a one-to-one correlation, when we put things together, it becomes much more complicated. And ships that we see on a single analysis, we actually lose in that complexity. Regional labour markets are complex systems, and actually it's very hard to point one thing which works in all places. We have to identify their structure is important, but we should overlook the role of agency either. The growth and resilience may not be the same thing. There is such a thing as bad growth. Growth actually puts us in a more precarious position, and we need to be thinking about the future when we look at growth. How regions and firms and households cope with existing shocks, and that this may leave them exposed to future shocks that come forward, either because they've been unable to replenish their stocks of human or financial capital, that there are longer-lasting income effects, or the issues of external support I mentioned, and the importance of risk sharing across territories. And finally, as I'm highlighting that the things that we see for policymakers is how important the foundations for future resilience by having adaptive capacity within our economies, rather than simply focusing upon structural dependencies. For time, and I hope there's plenty of opportunity for discussion at the moment.
Thank you very much, Adrian. It was very good. I think both speakers really kept well the time. Thank you very much. So it makes my life easy, my job easy for this webinar. I think we've heard very interesting aspects, and you understood that today we were focusing more on labor market aspects of of local economic resilience. I think one question I have probably already, I'll use my opportunity as an animator to ask this question. You mentioned, Adrian, that the key is to really work on this adaptiveness or capacity to adapt. But also both your projects, Menno and Adrian, you looked at the past economic crisis, and one of the things we could say is that perhaps this crisis had its causes and consequences and different impact, but future crises may arise and be completely different. So regions that were resilient this time may not be the ones that will be resilient next time. How can we adapt our measurements? How can we deal with this?
Thank you much, Natalie. I think this is a fundamental question, to be honest, because what we learned from the past is that what worked in the past in one place probably won't work again in the future, and what's successful for one region won't be necessarily successful for another region. We have to think about our own context and our own situation. So what I'm arguing is that in terms of measuring resilience, we shouldn't be trying to assess how resilient you are at the moment. I think that's difficult, but you never know what the next shock will be. You should always be asking the question, how vulnerable are we? How vulnerable are we to changing circumstances? To what extent our labour market, our firms, able to adapt to new circumstances that we can see, that we can potentially foresee, but possibly can't? Because then ask the question, how might we cope? What are the strategies that we have here? What are the adaptive parts that we have in place? Do we have communities who are able to take control of their own futures and actually build up their own ability to respond to new challenges? So let's measure resilience itself. I hate indexes of resilience, to be honest, because we should be asking the question, how vulnerable are we? How then can we cope and build that adaptive capacity for the future?
Thank you, Adrian. Menno, you want to respond to this too, or we can also perhaps open the floor for question in the meantime. You can already start asking question on your Q&A in the Q&A section there, and we'll gather the question and answer them.
Yes, thank you very much. I do agree with Adrian to some extent. On the end, if we want to learn what makes regions or what makes countries resilient, then the only thing we have is measuring resilience in the here and now and in the past. And I agree with both of you. We can never know what the next shock will be. But what we find quite strongly in the process we're running is that countries that have reformed their social security and labor relations are doing slightly better or significantly better in some cases than countries that did not reform their labor relations and their social security system. So in some way, an open, flexible, adaptive way of designing policies and implementing policies might be a good idea. So institutional veto points and so on and so forth, I think that's the main blockages, the main barriers to creating solutions to shocks. So I do think that at a higher level of abstraction, it might be possible to find some answers to the next crisis, and they are much more in the design and the institutional structure than they are in the concrete actions and factors. I do agree on that with Adrian.
Alexander, do we have already questions from the audience?
Yes, we have a few, so we'll show them straight away.
Can we also give the floor to all our panelists at the same time? I would like to invite Adrian, Menno, but also Neil from yesterday to react. So I think we have an immediate question for Menno. We are reading the question as you at the moment.
Do you want to take this first or shall I?
Do you first? It's your mother, your native language, so I need some time to reflect on it.
Very good point. I forgot to say, sorry, Adrian, I forgot to say that we need to speak slowly because not everybody is using, is a native English speaker, and so that's an important that Menno raises.
Yeah. First question, which is about the trade-off, in a sense, between GDP growth and levels of employment or levels of unemployment. Sorry, the thing moving on my screen at the moment. I think there's an important part here. There's a trade-off. There's a political choice. One of the things that we found prior to the crisis is that areas which had had very rapid GDP growth tend to be less resilient over time to the economic crisis or the economic shock, probably because there's an overheated economy. So I think we would argue that actually part of a resilient strategy is to think about how to promote a more equitable or more equal distribution of economic activity and economic value, rather than just to see GDP growth per se, and particularly not to see excessive disparities in wealth. When you have excessive disparities in wealth, you tend to find that the coping ability, the coping strategies available for those who are least wealthy are reduced at that stage. So I think the answer to the first question is that yes, we believe that would be a very positive part of a resilient strategy. It's part of my argument that not all growth is good growth at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And I do, to some extent, agree with Adrian, and I would like to raise the point we're doing in the project is that we deconstruct the unemployment figures to fit them for different groups. And I'm not sure if it does mean something for resilience, but what we do see is that the institutional conditions in some countries seem to affect specific groups in a good or a bad way more than in other countries. So we see countries that share the pain of crisis equally among different groups, but we see also countries which have clear losers and clear winners of the crisis. And I don't know if that's to be taken into account in terms of resilience, but I do find it very important when looking at resilience. A labor market might be quite quick, but at the cost of some groups, and I'm not sure if that is resilient or not. So I tend to agree with the first speaker that we need to also look at the distribution of wealth and the distribution of the pain between different groups.
I think, if I may, this is an important part. Resilience can be seen as an academic concept, but actually it's inherently political. Choices made at a policy level about what we as a society want to see. And I think taking you back to your starting point, Natalie, for this, which is talking about some of the larger long-term challenges, again, this is something we need to start to consider in that process about what is it that we think of when we talk of resilience and what are we as a society looking to develop at this stage.
Mm-hmm. It's true that it's not easy to focus on that and then focus still on the local labor markets. How do we keep the big picture into account? And as we're trying to, you mentioned, Adrian, you hate indices. Now, as we are trying to help local policymakers, what kind of framework, what kind of tools can we give them to integrate all these complex issues together? That's really tricky, I find.
Right. I mean, I can't give you instant answers because, to be honest, in each labour market, the answers may be different. But the thing we found was that training is very important. That's something that one would want to be promoting over time. What we found was that qualifications are important, but a sudden dash to qualifications, where you suddenly increase the number of qualifications you have in an economy over 3 years, isn't really helpful, probably because the labour market in terms of employers keep up with that. Actually, the utilisation of those qualifications, those skills, would be underexploited. So you've got a wasted labour market at that point. There, I think, there are many different lessons which we already know about in terms of active labour markets and how to emulate them. I think the key thing for us is when you're developing those policies, think about how it helps your labour market to be able to adapt to circumstances for what you have at the moment. The difficult questions, rather than have labour market policies which simply replicate current patterns or lock people in to the existing structures and the existing activities. I think the inability to adapt is the biggest challenge that we see in creating resilient labour markets.
Thank you. We see more questions. Alexander, can we make sure that Neil can also be part of the discussion? I'm not sure I think he's muted for the moment, so we would need to have him on board. Perhaps I think there are a few questions from Menno on use of the INSPIRE model. I think it could be used could it be used for gender analysis? I mean, using women as a vulnerable group, I guess, as you did for youth or older workers?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. We didn't do it because they're not basically vulnerable group in the countries we have seen, but the data are there, so it could be quite simple to perform the same trick as we did for the other groups. We did it necessary because they're not as vulnerable as some of the other groups that we have defined, but yeah, the simple answer is yes, it could.
And what about this other question about, I think, this threats matching and weaknesses, etc. Is how to answer this question? How vulnerable are we? Do you see them as useful? I don't know exactly what these TOW's analyses are about, so perhaps you can highlight hers.
I think the reverse of SWOT, so it's strengths, opportunities, weaknesses, and strengths at that stage.
Exactly. Okay.
Yes, I presume.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Good.
I mean, analysis or SWOT analysis is one way of doing this. For the analysis you do, it depends on the questions you ask, and about the way that you frame the data that you're collecting as well. Whilst I said I dislike indexes, I dislike them because they tend to rank places, and we say, oh, we're more resilient than you are, or you're more resilient than we are. That's helpful. What is a kind of a dashboard approach, perhaps, saying we are at risk in this area because we're over-specialized at the moment. If this company collapses, our economy is at significant risk. Or what happens if this market shuts its borders in the future? How vulnerable our value chain or our supply chain? It's the sorts of questions that, at a labour market level, I might be asking. And I think you can have dashboard analysis. You can do evidence-based working on that basis. And as I said at the beginning, you learn from the past. It's just not replicate the past in what you try to do again now.
I do agree with Adrian. One of the first instances, as I've shown in the INSPIRE model and also as Adrian has shown, there are a lot of factors that are underlying the resilience. So it might be good to not focus on a single or a limited set of factors, but to do indeed an analysis from a broad perspective with all of the conditions that we know are of impact of resilience. So a SWOT analysis or any other kind of analysis are quite good, and I would always advise them to do that on the sectoral, the national, but also on the individual level. For instance, what we experience quite strongly in the INSPIRE project is that employability and the incentive to become employable at the individual level is important as well. So to what extent are people broadly or trained or specialized, and so on and so forth.
Yes.
And about Neil, he is still there as well.
No, I'm listening in. It's absolutely fascinating. Good afternoon, everyone. I think getting a deeper conversation added to what we had yesterday. A few thoughts, if I may. It's quite clear, isn't it, that the resilience is very complex, and there's many factors involved in it. And just listen to your discussion, it seems to me there's types of ways of measuring resilience. There's one that seems to be coming out, which is a singular describer of the labour market or business confidence or jobs growth. And then there's the measurement that's much more about the inherent adaptive capacity. And I'm struck by Adrian's work there in terms of the business, people, place and community fits. And the work that we've done at CLES is very much looking at the interrelationships, the network or the particular milieu that those particular things operate in a particular locality. We use a different set. We use public, commercial, social, governance, environment, identity and health and wealth, but nevertheless similar, and it's linked to Menno's point there, that it is actually about the range of factors and how they interconnect and relate within a place if you wish to try and start measuring the inherent adaptive capacity.
I think this is a really important point. The piece of the work that's done by a German academic, a gentleman called Robel, looked at business clusters in Germany during the economic crisis. He took sectors, and what he identified was that businesses which were part of clusters tended to be more resilient to economic crisis than those which were isolated. They did a lot of quantitative results work to do that, but they then looked at that in a qualitative sense, and what they found was that competitors in those clusters were actually giving soft loans to their competitors. They were supporting their competitors through their difficult times and the economic shock. The reason is that they were committed to these to maintain the kind of business environment, because they recognised that in positive times they were all strong together. That adaptive capacity is really hard to measure.
And I completely agree, and I think that's a good example. And in our own work, for instance, in Portland, in Oregon, we found that high levels of social capital translated into higher levels of business innovation. And again, there again you have that, but very much hard to measure. But certainly there's a qualitative case study tale which one can learn from in terms of those relationships between things. I think there is something in the networking of particular activities within a place, which is almost like the strands of DNA, if you like, in a place, how those can create this inherent, innate adaptive capacity. And just one other point about changing, actually, about the economic growth point synonymous with resilience. Economic growth, steady state, or even no growth, I think you can get resilience or non-resilience in any of those. I think you can get a resilient economy which has no growth. Similarly, you get a resilient economy that's got lots of growth. It's very much more about the nature of how that locality operates.
I think very important point to make.
If I just may add something, because I see on this question there are questions about absolute levels of GDPs and about richer countries more resilient or possibly more dependent. And also there is this other question about experiences in countries that have gone through austerity measures since the crisis. Perhaps this is something to think about. But I like very much the point here. How do we define resilience with limited growth, especially if we're going to be talking about regions that are shrinking, and it's going to be one of the focus of our next webinars too. What does it mean for them being resilient in a way? If you not have growth, then what does it mean to still be resilient? But perhaps some of you can react to this GDP and GDP question, the austerity measures.
I think an answer. Go on.
I was going to say. Sorry.
This is Menno. I think what we see is the opposite, but it has it needs some explanations. So countries that are doing quite well in our model are countries with a lot of migration. So for instance Bulgaria, Hungary, and so on, and this has all to do with labor migration. So unemployment is not increasing because people move to other countries in which they can find jobs. So I'm not sure if it is good for the country, but in terms of our model, they're performing quite well. So that's the first one. That's about the absolute level of GDP which play a role. And I don't know anything about the austerity measures at this stage. We have focused on the crisis, and we don't know a lot about what happens next. One thing is remarkable, though. Of our model, we find that there are countries which have a quite a stable line of policy development with initiatives that go along back, and we have countries that tend to flip forward back between different policy measures. And the thing that we seem to find is that a consistent line of developing and reforming the welfare state and the labor market seems to contribute to more resilience than the flip-flop policy some other countries are doing.
That's a very good point. Is actually policy consistency over the long term can be a very important part of creating resilient economies. just 2 quick points if I make around this, answering those questions. I think Mano's point, the choice that people are making in terms of taking migration options, is a very important demonstration of the role of agency. That people and firms make choices, and we have to understand the choices that people are making in understanding how or why places are resilient. So some places, though, that are relatively wealthy were badly affected by the economic crisis and would not have been described as resilient. Ireland would have been a case in point in that sense. So it's not the question that richer countries are necessarily more resilient, but often richer countries have more resources to actually support themselves during an economic downturn. So it raises questions about the buffer and capacity places on there. And I think that lack of buffer and capacity is what we're seeing as difficulties at the moment in those countries which are going through austerity measures since the crisis, that they've lost that ability to create new opportunities and new possibilities, which is why the importance of sharing risk and the importance of external support becomes very important.
I think this is very fruitful. We did some work in Culiacan, which is a city in West Mexico, and it has around 10% growth rates, part fueled by US investment in that locality. And we went there just before the GFC, and whilst it was very important, very impressive levels of growth, then it was probably unresilient because it was heavily dependent, of course, on that growth and inward investment from the US. And as soon as GFC came along, of course, it since struggled. But what it didn't do, even when it had growth, it wasn't actually developing its structure with that growth, or developing its physical infrastructure or social infrastructure. So there's something about this relationship of how cash wealth to create resilience needs to be harnessed for public social ends. Failure to do so would actually make you more vulnerable in terms of any crash shock that comes away.
Absolutely. Natalie, can we just quickly tackle this question of knowledge economy in 1 minute?
Yes, exactly.
Because I think a very important point here is that if we think about the knowledge economy in terms of a standard economic sector, then specialization in that could make you vulnerable to economic shocks. Part of the knowledge economy, of course, is if we think of it as an input into a resilient community, for example.
Yeah. So
social media is a really important organizing framework that we've seen in numerous examples around the world and across Europe. So it can be used as a mechanism to support resilience, whether as an input rather than as an economic sector. The challenge, of course, is as we become more dependent on mobile communications, electricity and so forth, we may become more vulnerable to natural climatic shocks, for example, which might actually tip over the infrastructures that we're using in that sense.
Perhaps I'll give you the opportunity for one last word, Menno and Neil, if you want to pick on any question that you see that we have not answered. There is I think it's more a comment on social stability and community cohesion as a possible measure of resilience when there is no growth or even high unemployment.
There's a few things there, I think. I think there is something about, and it linked to what Adrian said, I think earlier on, I think there is something about governance and policy and governance that is aware of, understands that there's a need to think about this adaptive capacity of the economy, and in that, if they appreciate the networked approach to an economy, I think is a good position. When you have policy which is very singular, not or heterogeneous in how it's thinking about the economy, I think that's a fundamental flaw. So a governance process that appreciates a range of different inputs and is to extend diversity in locality is very, very important. And so, of course, it has to have within environmental limits and social justice as a kind of overriding frame to that. Because I think that is also, I think resilience should be seen as something socially and environmentally progressive. I think that's a political point of view, perhaps, but I do believe it's important in terms of that resilience is claimed as a progressive agenda, rather than something that's very narrow of an economic growth or a particular neoliberal view of economic growth.
Thank you. Menno, you want to have a final word?
Yeah, thank you. I would like to come back on the question of is there a specific resilience for a country which lives on a bubble and so on. I think what we all have learned in doing research on resilience and labor market resilience is that there's a lot of factors that affect or predict the level of resilience of the country. So if GDP growth is on a single factor or single industry or a single aspect of or regional economy, it cannot be the case that such a community can be resilient. But because we know that resilience is based upon a lot of different factors. So in a bubble and so on and so forth, we know that resilience is a multi-causal effect. So in defining and becoming a resilient community, you need to invest in these multi-level, multi-factor portfolio rather than a single, strong, unique selling point. And I think that's a lesson that we all have learned in doing research about resilience.
Thank you. Adrian, you want to have a final word?
Just one final dimension, which picks up on Neil's point around governance. Other work that we've done has been looking at the balance of activity, which is dependent upon what happens at the national level versus the local versus the regional. To be honest, the national is extremely significant in all of this. 3/4 of the work that you can find at the local or the regional level is dependent on what happens at the national level. We have to see resilience as a shared responsibility. Shared responsibility between national governments, local authorities, regional governments, but also perhaps at the supranational level. So we shouldn't forget the role of, in Europe, institutions like the European Union as well from there. And we often think that local areas can go it alone. That's not the case. There is room for manoeuvre. There's room that individual authorities can develop good practices, but that has to be seen in the context of a wider governance agenda as well. So that note of a shared responsibility, I think, is fundamental to all of this.
Very good.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Adrian. That's a very nice ending word for our webinar. Alexander, if you can give me the floor again, I would like to share my screen one last time to explain a little bit the next steps, and we will close then discussions. Thank you to everybody. Just to explain a little bit the next steps. As we said, these are the two first webinars, Understanding Resilience, but we will have Resilience in Practice webinars. Two of them are planned in January. One will be on aging and shrinking societies and regions and local areas, and the other one will be on the challenge of transitioning to a green economy. We have a space for a last webinar in February, and we want to hear from you, participants, and to know which topic you would like us to address. So you will get a chance after this webinar. You will hear from us, and you will have a chance to give us your suggestions for this last webinar topic in February. I also want to inform you that we will launch a call for local case studies, because something that came up also in the past 2 days is that we need to build local evidence and hear these stories of local resilience. So you will also hear from us on this point. And finally, these are our first webinars for the LEAD program, so we are really happy to hear your suggestion how we could improve the format and make this better, so we can really improve for the next round of webinars, but also perhaps in the future. So now it's time to leave, and I would like to thank all panelists. Thank you very much for this lively discussion. I think in the past 2 days we learned a lot, and now we have a lot on our plate to use all these good thought to be in our work and to be drafting our papers on resilience. But we will also be active trying to see how we can use perhaps a dashboard approach to help, because as I said, we really wanted to have a more practical input in this discussion. So if you follow our newsletter with the LEAD program, you will hear more from us. I also want to thank the Simpraxis team for having hosted on the technical side the two webinars, and I want to thank also Angela Atri, my colleague, who has been very active in the shadows to make these webinars possible. So thank you to all, and I wish you a nice evening or rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks a lot,
Thanks,
everybody.
Menno. Thanks, Natalie. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.